A new poll released by Morning Consult reveals voters are not only losing confidence in Joe Biden, but their faith in the Democratic Party as a whole has been shaken. More specifically, the survey found that voters view the Democratic Party as more ideologically extreme than the GOP by 9 percentage points.
Here to elaborate on these revelations is Cameron Easley, Morning Consult's lead analyst for U.S. politics. Cameron, welcome to the program. So, Cameron, I just have one big question after reading this. Why? Why are more Americans, why do they view Democrats as more extreme than Republicans? Because this was really circulating across X, formerly Twitter, and a lot of the responses from many of the users were there is no way this is possible.
Well, whenever Joe Biden was campaigning in the 2020 presidential election and after he won, coming into office, he made no secret of his intentions to govern in the style of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and, bring the return of big government back to Washington. And, Democrats, while they haven't gotten everything that they wanted in the past few years, especially when they had full control of Congress, they have spent quite heavily to provide, tangible benefits to Americans. So I think in terms of the perception of Democrats' leftward drift ideologically under Biden, it might be as simple as a case of voters believing what Democrats have been telling them.
How is the question framed, and were specific policies or issues raised when asking the question? Do we have any sense of what voters are thinking about when they characterize the Democrats as extreme? Are they really talking about some of the social spending during COVID, like having child poverty? Is that the kind of extreme action that voters are attributing to the Democratic Party?
So this is a very generally phrased question that we've been tracking every year, going back to when we started this annual State of the Party survey in 2016. So we've got about 8 years of data there. And the question just asks, whether the Democratic Party is too liberal, about as liberal as it should be, or not liberal enough. On the other side of the aisle, we ask if, the Republican Party is too conservative, about as conservative as it be, or not conservative enough. So I think it's important to note that we are talking about a traditional left-right ideological spectrum through which we're viewing this question. When you look at kind of the two-axis ideological question, there is a vertical axis that goes along with the left liberal right conservative axis. And that is, at one end you have authoritarian, and at the other end you have libertarian. Now, that's not something that, the layman necessarily is going to understand as well. And it's much more challenging to kind of test opinions in that way. So we've seen a lot of pushback, from Democrats online and framing these kind of responses in the context of January 6th and, what many would see as Trump's authoritarian impulses. I think it's important to note that might not be captured here in the way that some might think at first glance.
Cameron, let me ask you this question. What impact do you believe some of the social, cultural debates that we're having in the country in terms of gender? I think many on the right have really sort of brought some of these issues to the forefront. What impact do you believe this is currently having on the way people view both parties?
I don't think you can ignore it. It's definitely having something of an impact. We saw a pretty large backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. I think was a huge moment, and I think we saw a lot of groups kind of falling. A lot of groups on the left kind of tagging on to that line and suffering some blowback because of it. I think, Republicans kind of looked at that situation, saw that they were able to work with it, and just have kind of tried to continue to push culture as much as possible since then. I do think there is a genuine question about which cultural issues will be particularly salient in next year's election. Going into 2022, I think in a lot of cases, people underrated the impact that the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe v. Wade was going to happen on the feeling of cultural politics in our country. And I also think, people underestimated somewhat how January 6th would. So I do think it's possible that it's certainly possible that Democrats have some weak points on cultural issues going into 2024, but I do think there's a real question about whether that will be the biggest cultural talking point next
Cameron,
year.
you mentioned Black Lives Matter. Can you name a Democratic candidate who ran on Black Lives Matter and who lost, and whose loss can be attributed to their standing by that movement?
That's a really good question, Brianna. And I think, honestly, the answer to that question is no. Mm-hmm. And the interesting part there is how stances by certain advocacy groups translated pretty neatly for some voters onto candidates who actually took pains to distance themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I would use a little less passive voice there. I think there was very much a campaign spearheaded by the Democratic Party to distance itself preemptively from Black Lives Matter, even when it was, in fact, very popular. And there were 20 million Americans who took to the street to protest the injustice of unauthorized police killings, extrajudicial killings of American citizens. But Joe Biden started pivoting hard when he became the nominee and arguing that we needed to fund the police harder, arguing specifically to the American people that they risked Trump being president again if they continued to support the Black Lives Matter movement. And I frankly think that is very attributable to the distancing that many Americans put between themselves and a movement that they organically supported. They felt like it was a trade-off, Donald Trump or Black Lives Matter. Biden positioned it as that kind of a trade-off, and we saw that consequently. I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the other sort of extreme actions that are being taken right now by the Republican Party. In the news currently is the fact that as part of these debt ceiling negotiations, House Republicans are advocating to cut Title IX by nearly 80%. That is the single program that provides funding for low-income schools known as Title I education grants. Does a poll like this or any other polls that you've been doing capture public opinion about actions like that one?
Well, I think it's very important to understand and realize how much of the public knows about what goes on in the halls of Capitol Hill, even what members of Congress are staging news conferences to promote. We have some survey findings out just this morning on what voters know of about the potential for a government shutdown later this week, and what is out there that is kind of contributing to that. And so, we asked voters, based on what you know, do you believe that we're at risk of a shutdown later this week because Republicans are unable to come to an agreement with other Republicans, because Democrats are unable to come to an agreement with other Democrats, or because Republicans and Democrats are unable to come to an agreement with each other? And by a more than 2-to-1 margin, voters believe that it's because Republicans and Democrats are at disagreement, not that Republicans are at disagreement with their own party. So I think that tells you a lot about what the people who are really closely tracking these events are thinking about these situations and how they view how the public might respond to them versus what the public itself is actually tracking and has an informed opinion on.
Mm.
Cameron, the Biden White House would point to several things such as the CHIPS Act and other major pieces of legislation as success points for the president, things that the president could potentially run on. Yet, despite those things, and I think the president recently said, I'm delivering on my promises to the American people, yet the American people still appear to believe that Democrats are more extreme than Republicans. How do you think that will translate, however, in terms of a rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump? Like, does that belief of extremism of one side correlates to them voting for the other side, or not necessarily?
Well, I think it's important to remember that views of extremism are not going to always be easily captured in survey data, especially especially depending on what kind of extremism we're talking about. We can look at the survey data all we want, but we also need to remember to look at the election results themselves. The polling heading into the 2020 midterms did not look good for Joe Biden. It did not look good for the Democratic Party. Pretty much the only thing that it looked like they had going for them from a political perspective was the backlash to the abortion decision by the Supreme Court. But when it came time in competitive races and toss-up districts, what we saw was Democrats were actually quite effective in a persuasion message. And looking toward 2024, if Donald Trump is the nominee, that's obviously the way that Democrats are going to try to take the conversation, make it about democracy, to make it about freedom of personal freedom of choice, and basically just try to do the same thing that worked in 2020 and 2024.
Thank you so much for joining us, Cameron.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Cameron.